Good morning. Nice to see some faces and really nice to be in the college. You have to bear with my Zoom skills here. This is my first time sort of gluing together Keynote and a second monitor and an IDE. I think we're going to be okay though. So I'm going to start, I'm going to share some screen so you don't need to look at me and you can look at my sick Keynote skills. And then we'll get started. Okay, so today we're going to walk through making a modern web application with React and TypeScript and lots of love. And the order of what we're going to be working on today is we're going to do just an introduction about what React is, sort of assuming you've heard of it. Maybe you've tried it a little bit, or you've heard of it and feel like you should try it and aren't sure why. And so by the end of this, you should know what it can do and if it's interesting to you. One of the most interesting things is learning to think in React, and that's what grabbed me when I first was exposed to React. It was a new way of thinking about building interfaces. And if there's anything to get out of this course, it's not going to be so much syntax and like tool chains and very specific details. It's going to be more about the thought process that goes with building React. It exposes us to functional programming a little bit and this concept of declarative interfaces, which is super powerful. And it's, you know, if you never write another line of React, it's neat to just sort of have in your mental tool chest when you're building sites and applications. In order to do this, we're going to build up a little application as we go along. You can see in the COVID theme, thought it was time to do a little fitness tracker. I've been trying to run and do my yoga as we do, and I like stats. So this is going to scrape some data. So it's a simple one-page little web app that has a little bit of interaction and a little bit of storage. Yeah, and we'll build it over the course of the next 2 hours. TypeScript comes at the end. TypeScript is pretty fantastic, and I wanted to do it all along, but I didn't want to muddy the concept. But I'm going to have some time for it. Because TypeScript has been a booster in the past year and a half when it comes to front-end work, maybe 2 years. I was hesitant to get on the TypeScript bandwagon, mostly because it felt like a bandwagon. But then as soon as I did, I never wanted to go back. And it's the sort of thing that the more you use, at least for me, the more you can't imagine living without when you're writing front-end code. And so I'm excited to show you that too. Well, those cool Keynote colors, huh? Pretty nice. So what's React? React is an interface library. It's not a full framework like Rails or Django or Express is a server. It's all concerned with creating user interfaces. It handles your interaction and your presentation. The target has got multiple targets. So we're going to be working on just making web today. But there's React Native, which will let you build for Android and iOS. There are Mac OS and Windows targets, both interestingly created by Microsoft. And you can even write React that renders on the server and then gives you static pages from your node server. So it's got various targets and there's more sort of coming on. We're just gonna be worrying about web today. It's mostly JavaScript. It's got this superset on top of it called JSX. And if you look at the little snippet to the side there, you'll see that the return p hello, like that's not legit JavaScript. And that's where we get into the JSX. I don't know what JSX stands for. But it's basically this markup that lives within your JavaScript and is compiled into legit JavaScript code. So we'll go into that a little bit more as we progress. React is just the interface. It doesn't do persistence. It doesn't store your data. It does do nests. shape your data, or how to navigate in your app, or how to manage your styles, or how to structure your architecture, your information architecture. There are pieces that are commonly glued together for all of these things. So for persistence, you would see things like Redux going to browser stores. There's well-trodden paths for each of these elements. But when you're working with React, you'll often find yourself picking from your favorite routing library and styling library, for example, and bringing them together. Today, we're not really touching much of this. We're going to do a little bit with persistence and networking, just the bare minimum to make our app work. But it is just something to be aware of, is React is only concerned with presenting the data, and how you get it and how you manage that data will be a separate concern. Docs of what is React, they talk about building simple views for each state of your application. Catch up my notes here. Mm-hmm. I don't know, is the baseline. Yeah, React I think is pretty, I can jump into, yeah, I believe it's Node 10. It doesn't need to be super bleeding edge. Okay, so React is basically about change management. So we're going to talk a lot about the state of your application, what state your application is in at a given moment, and how to show that. And so a way to think of why React exists, if you've ever worked with jQuery and sort of the more traditional web development, the web development that I came up with, it would be pretty often to bind a click handler to a button, and that button fires, and you do an AJAX request, and you listen for the responses, and you unbind the button, or maybe you temporarily disable it so people can't double click and triple click. And then you get your data back, and you do some inner HTML to stuff it into the DOM. And now you need to rebind things, but maybe you should unbind them just to be sure, and then you rebind them. And you get this really sort of chaotic, defensive or fearful coding style, where you don't quite know what state your application is in. And so you have all this defensive code trying to prevent yourself from shooting yourself in the foot, or the user from doing something that's not possible. So React is a reaction to that, you could say. React is a solution to that. So React wants us to define a view for every state that our application can be in. These views are called components, and you'll have lots and lots of them as you build up your application. So a state, as you can see over on the side, that your application could be in would be like a logged in state or not. And if it's in the logged in state, we want to show welcome back. And if not, we show the who are you message. And in order to make a UI in React, we're going to be defining all those states. We're going to be using props in state. The language is a little bit confusing. To say how we want our application to look, what should be rendered. And so this is with the declarative programming style. This is where we're going to declare everything that is possible. And we're going to be able to write tests against it. We're going to be able to see all that logic written in a really a clear place. It's the logic about what to show is really close to the component. So we don't have to go check way up at the top of the DOM tree to see whether we're logged in or not. We have that header component. React, so we're going to talk about props and state, and those are the two mechanisms React gives us to change how a view looks. And we'll go into those in detail in the next couple of slides. But basically, these are the only ways we're allowed to modify anything. And React it has a lot of tricks to prevent us from modifying things elsewhere. So we're not going to have any globals, or very few globals. Everything that a component needs and a view needs is going to be defined. It's going to be predictable, no matter how many times we render, it's going to give us the same predictable result. So this is going to make what we solid, easy to reason about, really easy to extract and test in isolation, and then hopefully just easier to build high quality applications with. So components are at the core of React. So a component can be big or it can be small. A component returns a chunk of markup. All components are functions, and this is probably one of the weirdest things that takes a bit of time to get used to. But every component is a function, and it gets some input, and these are the props, the properties that are passed to that function, and then it returns some chunk of markup. And in the middle of it, it may bring in other components that are also functions that may or may not have props of their own that they want to get. And they'll return their markup to our parent component, and our parent component will return it back up the tree. And so we're going to get this nested hierarchy of components, each passing props down to each other. This idea of one directional data flowing from the top down is really important to React. There's ways to work around it, but you're very explicit when you're doing it. You're not accidentally modifying the prop of a parent. It doesn't work. You have to very explicitly say, I want to modify something higher above me. So React really wants this one-way flow down of props flowing down into components. So looking at the little pseudocode over on the side here, we can see that we can import some components. That's what's happening in the beginning there. Those are components within our own project. I've brought in a Sparklines component, which is a third-party component. So there's a whole ecosystem of third-party components of date pickers and maps and calendars and all that that you can bring in that are pre-written. All the design frameworks, Bootstrapped and Material, all have their extensive React components if you want to use theirs. And then the function app shows an actual component of our own. And I'll just walk through this one a little bit. And we're going to have lots more walking through components. So if we don't get everything here, don't despair. So this function is going to give us an app component. So an angle brackets app. You'll see the way we call components is a lot like XHTML. So it's like HTML, but it's got the closing single bracket. If it's unbalanced and closed. So it's, and it takes an optional props, and props is an object, a JavaScript object. And it's up to us what we want in those props. There's not any required props. We can call them, we can have logged in props or title props or favorite emoji props. It's totally up to the context of your application. And then once we get into our function, we just run regular JavaScript. So you see here, I'm checking to see if there is a props title. And if not, I'm putting in my own fallback string. And I'm just declaring a regular const. But you could do all your regular loops in here. You could do all sorts of regular JavaScript that you need to get down to the return, which is where sort of the Reacty JSX-y part happens. So up until then, we're just running regular JavaScript. And then down when we get to the return statement there, it gets interesting. So our return statement is weird for regular JavaScript, and that's where JSX comes in. So it's pulling in, or it's rendering a page component, which was imported up at the top by us, and it's passing it our variable page title, and that's going to become page's title prop. So page has a prop called title on it, and we can pass whatever we wanted into it. Inside that page component, there's going to be a header component, and it takes two props, a logged in Boolean and a user string. And you'll notice those are passed a little bit differently. Logged in gets a true in squiggly brackets, curly braces, squiggly brackets. And so the curly braces mean actually executing Java. So that's a true Boolean value. We could, if we passed it in as a string, it would be a string that said the word true. So we can pass in actual JavaScript to be evaluated by the child components. And then the user, the fonme string, is just a straight up string. Something similar happens with the Sparklines third-party component we brought in. So that Sparklines component takes a data prop. And the data prop is meant to be an array of numbers. A Sparkline is if we get time, we'll show you in the little fitness app. It's just a tiny little graph that you can sort of put in the middle of a sentence, a little chart, way to visualize data. So it takes some data points, it wants an array of integers. So here we are making up our app component, and the app component contains a page component, and the page component contains both a header and Sparklines component. They may have child components below them, we don't know. And our app component can then be rendered by itself or nested inside other components, or nested multiple times inside other components. So that's kind of the guts of what happens, what's a component in React. Talk a bit about JSX. This is a little bit more about it. I kind of covered most of this actually. What I'll show you, we'll just walk through this code sample on the side again here a little bit, is JSX doesn't just have to go at the end. It can go anywhere throughout our React file. And you just kind of look for angle brackets. So where if you see the const header and const footer, you'll notice that we're dropping in components right in the middle of our our prelude, right in the middle of our function here, before we get to that return block down at the end. If you go a little bit further down to the nav items loop, you'll see that we're looping through an array of strings, and we're turning that array of strings into an array of list items. And so those list items are React components in their way. They're DOM elements, but they're treated like React components. And this is us being able to use JSX anywhere in our React component file here. So this component is pretty typical of what sort of thing you might see. You would see props up at the top, figuring out the title, figuring out our fallbacks, setting up some variables for use later on where they make sense, and you might use a little bit of JSX up top. You'll manipulate your data as you go down your function, maybe build up a little bit more JSX to be used right at the end. And then right at the very end, you have your final return statement, which you must have, that returns the actual code, the actual component with a bunch more JSX. So we'll get a little bit more experience with that as we progress along as well. In React, there are two ways to give data to your component. So if we didn't have these, the component would render the same thing over and over and over. It wouldn't be very exciting. We need to be able to change. We need to be able to represent different versions of our app, different states of our app. So React gives us two different ways, states and props. And these are one of the things that just takes a while to get an intuition of in the beginning. And honestly, as you progress, there'll be cases where this could be state, this could be props, and they could both be equally valid options. I'll give you sort of the canonical examples here. So props come from outside a component. Down from a higher level. They may be root of your application and all the way down to a tiny button, 5 layers deep, 20 layers deep. And they're read only to the component. So the component can trust they always are going to be the same. The component cannot modify them. this is one of the strengths of React, is it knows that this thing can't change. It can all sorts of optimizations that say just stop checking it. We don't need to check that for changes. We never need to consider whether this component needs to be re-rendered. The props are just fine. The props are guaranteed to be consistent and unchanged between renders. State is managed inside a component and is meant to change. So our apps aren't static. They don't just sit there. You need to be able to interact with them. And that is where state comes in. So the important things about state is where they're sort of encapsulated. So the state of a button component, if we want to put state inside a button component, the thing above the button, like the nav bar, won't know about the button's state. Only the button will know, and if any children it might have can have access to that. So if we're thinking, again, like a sort of a hierarchy with your root component and descending down, you can have state at any level of that, but only things below where the state is set up will have access to it. And some examples are probably going to be pretty helpful. So again, we're going to be doing lots more of this, so don't despair if it doesn't super click immediately. So over on the code sample here, the first example just uses props. So this is really similar to what we've seen before. So props, in this case, we just decided to have a logged in prop. Again, we choose what our props are. They're based on whatever we need. And there's no way to say props logged in equals false within here, or true, or anything. It's locked to us, it's read only. Then if we go down, we can look at state. And here we're getting a little bit wackier. So this app component doesn't have props. It's just going to have state. And this is the way React sets up state. It uses this function, it's called a hook, and the hook is use state. And use state gets an initial value. And so in this case, it's 0. And whenever you call that use state thing, it gives you 2 results. One is the actual variable that references the state, so that's count. And then you have the setter, the function that changes your state. And that, in this case, is called set count. So if we read down to our return block here, you'll see we're spitting out the count is whatever number it is, and then we're having a button that increments this. So I think this might be a good chance to jump into a little bit of live coding this, just so you can actually see interacting it. So I'm going to go to code sandbox.io. Pardon me? I do have the URL for that. And this is a free, yeah. Sorry, everybody. How do I chat, Ashley? Oh, it's not a specific one, is it? Nope. Okay. Code Sandbox. There we go. So this is what mine looks like. I'm going to try to bump up the browser size a little bit. I'm just going to the new Sandbox. You can use CodePen or any other thing that you're comfortable with. I liked this one because it seemed really simple. So I just click new, and they have a React template ready to go. It sort of wires everything up. And if all goes well, you should have something like this. So ignoring this export default stuff, this is in the style sheet up there. This is really similar to what we've been looking at all the way through the intro here. So I'm going to make a little function that takes some props. So we know that React components are just functions. Is this big enough for the screen? Can you sort of read what's going on? So we're going to have our React component. So this guy here is, I don't want that. It's going to create us a component called header. And React components have to return. So I'm just going to say return a p tag. And so now in this app component they've got wired up, we can put in our header component. And you can see over on the side, there it is, our first React component. Pretty nifty. And so we wanted to pass it some props. Title. So why don't we make this hello world? So we're going to say, who are you going to say hello to? You're going to say hello to world. So we're passing this prop to header, but header doesn't know what to do with it, so it just ignores it. So here, I can change this. And now we can the more absolute brackets. This is how you drop raw JavaScript code into the middle of some JSX. But so there's our the concept of adding props. You pass them down, they're read-only. We can't do anything with them here. But we wanted to show that state. I'm going to show that now too. So we need to actually bring in state from React. And so the state we want is we want a counter. And we want it to start at 0. So that's what we need to do. And then we need ways to interact with it. And this is just a bit of React magic that you get quite used to. If anyone's familiar with ES6, we are destructuring an array here. That's what that is. And it gives us count, which is a constant, which is just a number. That's the result of whatever is in here right now, and whatever is inside our use state. And set count is the way we change count. And why we need that set count is you're not allowed to do this. React will be not happy. Count is read only. And so this is part of the React magic where it knows what every variable is up front. It knows that they can't change. It knows it can trust them. It knows it can skip renders. And that's what React is trying to do all the time. It's trying not to re-render if it doesn't have to, because it's evaluating this code over and over and over and over and over. And any way that it cannot have to re-render is a performance win. So we can't do that. Instead, we have to go set count. And why don't we show our count here? So we're going to hello world times count. So we got hello world times 0 over here. And we're going to make an on-click function. So I don't know which way is more clear to do. I'm going to start by writing it up here separately. And I'll show you the other way to write it. It's just kind of more React-y. So I'm going to call this on button click. So this is functions inside functions. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It tripped me out when I first started seeing that this is like a legit JavaScript thing to do. It is, and it's done all over the place in these sort of modern front-end languages. So that's why that is what it is. So we're going to see that as we build our app. So we're going to set the count to the count plus 1. And now we'll give ourselves an on-click handler. And we need to use our curly braces because this is JavaScript we're passing in. So now, look at that. All day. 8. And so the things to sort of note here is this state, this count, the value of this count only lives in header. and the things below it. App doesn't have any access. And that's great because when changing the counter in the header, we don't need to worry about the footer or any other component needing to re-render. They can stay untouched. So state always has the reader and the setter, which is a function. And functions can have lots of different state. So you can have other count, set other count. And it could start at 5. And other count is 5. And set count times 2. Crazy things with our counts if we want. Oh, sorry, that was wrong. That should be other count. Anyway, point being, you can have multiple instances of state in your component. And so state changes and state is contained within the component that defined it. I said I was going to show you another way to declare functions, just so, well, let's come back to that. We've got enough going on right now. Props versus state. Okay, I think we're kind of at the end of the little whirlwind introduction. Right, let's try a bit. Code Sandbox. So our next step is going to be to actually dive into building this sucker. Here is what we're going to be building. It's got some data, endpoints. That is, this data is stale, so I can refresh, hopefully. And now it's up to date. It's got a toggle view, and it's got some filters. So this is our goal. If you are following along, that's awesome. You can, if you've never used Netlify, it's a great place to show your final product if you want to. If you're not following along, don't worry at all. I'm just going to be committing to a branch. I'm going to use a branch called deploy off of this repo, so I can leave the master clean and tidy. So this branch is where I'm going to just, every sort of chapter here, I'm going to commit the code up. So if you fall behind, don't worry. Yeah. We'll stop for questions, comments.
Yeah, good place to stop if anyone has any questions. I actually have a question.
What's your question, Ashley?
It blows my mind that we're using const and we're getting changed values. So clearly you're getting an entirely new const every time.
Yeah.
But that's the best practice? That's the typical approach to this?
Yeah, that actually is the thing. Great question. That exposes a really interesting concept of React here. So React functions can be read from top to bottom, and it's a really sequential sort of process, and it's worth reading them carefully that way. So these functions execute over and over and over, and then they're kind of just thrown away. And so by the time we get down to our return, this function is just done. And then if anything changes, it runs again from line, like right from the beginning. So count is a const. It doesn't change in the context of this application. These things here, these set state, set count, set other count, cause this function to render over again. And you can imagine key hidden entry point for React when setting state. So React, this use state magic, forces itself back up here to the top of your function, and then reruns everything with the state values. So it's pretty magical. Like it's not super intuitive. Like you said, why are consts changing along the way? But you saw that error before. If we try to reassign it, it's going to be unhappy with us, and React isn't going to be able to handle that. So what React is doing is it is getting us back to the top of our function and rerunning everything. So a really important concept as you get a little deeper into React is controlling your re-renders. And it re-renders, our component will re-render when when any of the props are not equal or the state is not equal. And so we'll talk about it as we get a little further into our application, because you kind of want to be careful with what you pass as props and what you pass as state. And you don't want to pass things that change all the time if they haven't actually changed. So if you pass two objects, I'm just going to bump open a JavaScript console here. Okay, getting into, hopefully you can, oops, you can see my console. So we know that A equals A. That works great. But if we were to pass an object as our props, and this is the comparison that React does if it decides if it needs to re-render your function. Objects, even if they're actually identical, are not identical in React's mind. So passing those in is going to cause things to re-render. It's a little bit of a diversion from, but the idea being that any change to props or state is going to force the whole thing to run again from top to bottom. So it's, in a way, you can kind of think of it like state is being passed in. That's probably the most useful way to think of it. Is state is sort of being passed in there, and all this use state stuff is like a little bit of magic, and anything after that is where the main logic that we can reason about begins. Anything else?
Ryan Paranich just has a comment here. It says, so const isn't changing, it's referencing something inside state, like some kind of variable in state, or it's completely rewriting the code itself every time it renders, like declaring the const differently each time.
Yeah, so the const doesn't change.
Oh, I might have muted you there.
So the const doesn't change during the course of this function's execution. So as soon as we get to, say, line 12 here, the const does not change. Kind of like the React controls this preamble. It does its magical thing with the use state. And after that, the const will not change. If we call set count, we're going back up to the top here. We're starting over. We're kind of throwing out, I mean, the code keeps executing, but once the set count is changing count and forcing us to re-render again. It's saying to React that the inputs are now different, so you need to come through and evaluate everything all over again. So it's referencing something. So the first const, yeah, I'm just trying to parse the question a little bit. It's a variable. Yeah, it's not really a variable. It's a thing that you can control and you can change and force a re-render from the top. You can't change it midway. So it's not variable, like it can vary over the course of the life of this one render. But renders are really, really frequent in React. And that's something we're going to look at when we build the app, is just how many times it re-renders, even if things don't change. And one of the key points of making these components is that they can render hundreds of times and it not affect the outcome, that they're safe. And that's what, when we talk about pure functions, that they're always the same. So if we set count to something who things will change with our equals equals, so the comparison, and that's going to force us to render again from top to bottom. So the variable is not changing in the course of the execution, but it's forcing a new execution. Is that clear at all? Ian, question? Or more questions?
Yeah, I'm always just thinking from the back end, like how is this going to interface with that? So I took a look in the public folder and saw the activities.json and vitals.json. Can I just safely assume that that theoretically these JSONs could be coming from a database?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, those are just kind of placeholders, just to give us something to work on. Yeah, how you get that data is an exercise left to the reader. I scraped mine out of a Google spreadsheet and made a JSON file. I'd recommend something cooler than that, though. Okay, now onto the fun parts. It's all fun. So hopefully this is big enough. Send us a note if not. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to try to do pretty much everything in VS Code, because it's got a little terminal down at the bottom, which is pretty fantastic. This week is my first time doing everything in the text editor, and it's worked pretty great. So we are using something called Create React App. And so if you look in that Git repo, you'll see kind of what happened. Create React App is a semi-official, I think it's a fairly official bundling up of React and a bunch of related technologies. It saves us from having to do a ton of configuration that is just not interesting, it's not relevant to what we're doing today. So we're just using them as a sort of a launching pad, because they've got all their NPM packages and their web packs and their Babels and their all that stuff that just makes your eyes glaze over. It's all set up nicely. You'll see there's a second commit in there where there's my modifications to get us to this point. My modifications were deleting a bit of stuff that's not relevant to the class, adding some sample files, adding the JSON files, adding a little bit of code formatting stuff. So you can check that out. But I'll give you a little tour of what comes, what we want to know about over on the left-hand side here. We'll start in the public directory. And so as Ian noted, there's some JSON files. These are just static files. These are what we're going to use to sort of simulate talking to a remote API. So just static JSON data and index.html. And so there's a lot of stuff that Create React App gives in here. It really isn't that important. It's fancy icons, stuff to make it look good on your mobile phone. The only thing to note in here is I've just injected some CSS from, it's called UI kit, just to make the thing look a little bit nicer than bare HTML. So this public directory is, it's going to be the root of our little mini web server here. We're not going to do anything in here after this moment. We're just sort of looking at what Create React App gives us there. React is going to inject application into this div with an ID of root. So that's kind of the main thing to know. And after this moment, we don't need to look in that directory again. So all you need to know is all this JavaScript is going to be bundled up magically, and document get element by ID, put it in the root div. And that div can be named whatever you want. More interesting is this source directory. And you don't need to sort of internalize this in any way right now. This is 100% just straight from Create React App. But what it's doing is it's going to import this app component, and this app component is where we're going to do everything. And it's, I should have taken this out too, actually, is wrapping it in this other React strict component, which just gives you more errors. So I'll just take that out so you can see how it actually would look. There. If you see my ID jump around like that, it's because there's a code formatter that runs on every save. It's not like, it's called Prettier. If you haven't used it, it's pretty fantastic. It stops you from having to reformat your stuff all the time. So what it's going to do is going to call this magic React method, pass it a component of our choosing, in our case, the app component, and it's going to put it in that root div that we saw earlier. It's also going to import style sheets because JavaScript wants to manage your CSS now. And after that, we don't need to look in this file again either. So this file, its only purpose is to look up a div, inject it with our root component, and throw in some CSS. So close that, don't need to look at that again. CSS, really, it's a pretty ugly app. It's some basic CSS, don't need to look at that again. So where we actually want to start looking is app.js. So I've cleared out the initial view that comes with the Create React App and just put in this little guy. So if we look here, it's a function, just like all our other stuff. It's returning a div with a p tag inside it. And these, let me show you one of the weird edges of React here. Instead of class, class name and an uppercase. This is how React does it. Why later, but just for now, that's just why. Or it just has to be that way to get CSS or HTML classes to work. And all these classes are just about, it's from that UI kit. So it's trying to center it and things like that. If you're not familiar with ES6 exports and modules, we need to return something from our file. We can't just, if we just went like this, our application wouldn't be able to see it. This kind of make it's private. So we need to export our functions that we want to make available to other files. So in this case, we're going to export. So we could do it this way, export default. You can also just write it like that. These two are identical. So again, try not to spend too much time on syntax. We're mostly trying to get a concept for React. So that's that. So what we need to do, I'm down my console here. I'm going to npm install, or yarn install is what I normally do, because React kind of prefers yarn, but I don't think there's any particular reason to do that. And npm start. And that's kind of the only bit of command line we're going to be doing. We're going to stop and start the server a couple times. And this is going to bump open. It's going to start compiling everything. And it's going to open the web app in Chrome on localhost port 3000. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed the workshop. No, we can do better than that. So here is our React app. How do I do this? So the first thing I'm going to do is we want to watch what's actually happening. So I usually put in some console logging along the way. So I'm just dumping that in. This create React app part of what gives us is live reload, so things change like magically fast. I'll try to make this same. Let us know if you're having a hard time seeing anything. So I'm looking down at the bottom of my screen here at my logs, and I'll see, so the app rendered. Pretty neat. And we can go change things here. Exclamation points. Exclamation points. It's in the GitHub repos, and you may enjoy those. They give you, there's for Firefox and for Chrome. I'm a sellout using Chrome today. I feel bad about it, but it works really great for React. So you get these two purpley guys over here, and components lets you inspect the actual components. So we'll poke into this a little bit as we go along. I'm not going to do too much in here, but if you're following along or pulling down my changes, it's always interesting to look at the components to see what's being rendered. And I guess just for completion, if we go to our actual elements over here, you can see what was rendered in my div root was that markup. Very similar to that markup. Okay, so let's dive into it. So the first thing I want to do is we're going to start building, where did my boxes go? Sorry, everybody. I'm going to start building these boxes up here, these vitals, vital statistics, vital signs, whatever they are. Oh, I was going to show you the lib directory as well. If you cloned this, there is some functions that I just dumped in here that weren't worth typing out again, formatting raw data. And I also have that same, I have placeholder data here. So this is very similar to the stuff in public, but we're just going to start by using it for the placeholder data. So these are just constants, objects, objects, or JavaScript objects, I should say. So we're going to start by importing from lib placeholder data, import vitals. And just to prove that it's imported, we're going to log it in our debug log in there. And I'm just going to spit it out here so you can see in the console log what it looks like. So I'm going back to the browser. So we can see app render, app render, app render. App render this time has vitals. It's got 4 of them. And it's got these guys. They got some timestamps, heart rate, step count, energy used. So that's the data we're going to be working with and turning into our components. So we're going to build a little component here. Function by summary, and we know it's going to. So the props that are going to come in are going to be some measurements. Those are some of those data points, and a label. So it'd be like steps or heart rate, some nice text. And so if I'm just going to cut and paste a little bit here, so you don't have to watch me type. So if the measurements are empty, we're going to return a chunk of JSX here. So notice we've got a div, it's got that class name that React really wants. And then it's got an H3 tag and a P tag, pretty standard HTML stuff. And we're interpolating, we're putting in the label here by putting it in the squiggly brackets, curly braces. And so then this bails early, no measurements, nothing to do. Otherwise, kind of like the else condition down here, this show the vitals box with label. We'll give ourselves a little to do. So now let's actually put it into our app here. So now we're going to make our real app. So we don't need all this placeholder stuff anymore. I'm going to make a class name called vitals boxes. This is just for a little bit of alignment. And I'm going to use my new vitals summary component here. So the component name is the same as the function name. And I know that our props that we need to pass in are label, which is a string, and measurements, which is an array. Now, as a preview of TypeScript land, I'm feeling afraid because I could pass a number to label and I could pass an object to measurements, and we wouldn't know until the app crashed later. So TypeScript is going to let us say what those should actually be. But we don't have that yet. That's for half an hour from now. So, oh yeah, I got to get my emojis. So my label is going to be steps. And my measurements, just for now, I'm just going to pass in nothing so we can see the empty state. This is going to reformat, fix my alignment when I save. So let's take a look, make sure it worked. Back to Chrome. No. So what we did, we made a component, which was a function. We gave it props of our choosing. We wanted a label and we wanted some measurements. So on this line here, I'm just guarding against a null value, a little bit of defensive coding. And then now we've got this no label to report. So we're going to do a few things to sort of evolve this here. So the measurements we actually want to pass in are that vitals constant that I imported before. Because our data is going to get or our components are going to get long, I'm going to extract this vital summary into its own file. It's customary in React to put one component per file. It's not the law, but it's just kind of what's done. So I'm taking, let's slow down here. So I'm taking that vital summary that we wrote before, that was just the top of app, cut, paste. It's hidden in the file right now, so I'm going to export it. So that is a complete React component. Doesn't do much, but that's a complete vital summary React component. It only takes props, has no state, as you can see, just props. And now I actually need to bring that in here. So now I've imported that component from its own file. So I'm going to make sure that renders again. We should be getting, because now we're actually passing in this vitals, this placeholder data, this heart rate and steps and all that. We should be having a slightly different message in Chrome. We do, we have our to-do message. So that's pretty good. I think at this point, I'm gonna do, maybe not yet, I'm gonna keep going. So now we want to actually show some of the actual data. Just catch up. So we're moving now to this chunk. So this no measurement stuff dealt with, we don't need to think about that anymore. It's a little bit awkward to get the data out of here. But so why don't I show you this to begin with. So inside our vital summary, we can log as well. So I would do maybe something like that and show what its props are. So I'll go back to Chrome and read that. Clear it, refresh it. So you see down here, that's the log statement we just put out, vital summary. And so it's getting this measurements guy, this measurements array. that has a few different, they all have timestamps. These represent days. And then they have different sort of metrics, different data points. So we just want to grab the steps out of this one. So in order to do that, it's a little bit convoluted. There, let me know if we get lost. I'm going to say, hey component, the data key you care about is steps. So we're giving it one more prop. Now I'm going to my component to tell it, now I've got a new prop. It's called data key. Now we want to get the actual data points out because we're going to show a list of them. So I could do it a few different places. I could do it before here or after here. I kind of like to do my data management all up front. It's not the most efficient. So I'm going to make a data points list, let's say. And it's going to take the measurements and it's going to map them. Map. So this is JavaScript array iterator. That's what map is. So it's going to take every array element and return a new value. So out of the measurement using its key. So this is taking my data point dot steps. This is the equivalent of going data point steps. And with that value, I'm going to return a little piece of JSX. So I'm just going to get through this little chunk here, and then I'll commit and have any questions or discussion about this. I don't think I need a class name on this. So I'm going to print out in curly braces the timestamp. And the actual value. Tighten this up a little bit. Okay. So what I've done here is I've created a constant. I've created a little temporary, I mean, it's a variable just for the life of this render, that becomes a list of LI tags. And the LI tags have the values from those measurements. And I'm going to stuff them down here in ordered listing. And now I can take my data points list and I can put it right there using the curly braces because it's JavaScript, it's not JSX. And so if all goes well, I should have a list of step counts now. So I'll bounce back to Chrome. So we got something. Kind of looks terrible, but we got something. We can make it look a tiny bit better. I'm gonna bring in one of my little helper functions. For that timestamp from. So I know my timestamps are all JavaScript timestamps. This guy just turns them into really basic dates. There we go. So 10,000 steps, 9,000 steps. Look at all those steps. Just go to this dev tools view here a little bit. So we've got our app, and it's now got underneath it one vital summary component. And this is where this dev tools is super helpful. You can see the props that we passed down. You can even change them and have it reflected up here. So super helpful for debugging stuff. React dev tools are some of the greatest things ever. So we've made one component, but we've kind of done all the work for the other two as well. So we've got a few different data points there. This component is really quite generic because of this data key that we passed in. So it made it a little hard to think about. If we go back to our parent, more versions of it. One for resting heart rate, and one for energy, bowls of ramen. Maybe I'll put these in the same order so it's a little easier to see. So the same component over and over, same data set, different labels, acting on a different key. Gives us this magical thing. So in DevTools, we see same component over and over and over, same bit of logic. So React components are reusable. And the holy grail when you're building your interfaces is to be able to reusable components. It doesn't always work, and a bit of luck to finding the right abstraction, saying this button will be reusable, or don't bother, just make it a one-off button. But anyway, that's the concept. It's these reusable components that change based on their props that are passed in. I think, yeah. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to commit this, and probably a good time if there's any questions before we move on to adding a little bit of state and a little bit of interaction to this guy. So everyone following along, okay?
I have another question. So you said that the well, the holy grail, like you said, is to create these reusable components. But you also said that the typical approach is to create a separate JS file for every component. I wonder, is your source folder going to get like really full of JS files, like uncomfortably so? Is there a typical approach to organizing them in any way?
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we can put these in folders right now if we wanted. And that would be pretty typical. Is you'd create a folder, you would try to figure out some grouping that made sense to you. And so on that slide where I said React doesn't include an architecture, it's left to you to decide the way you want to structure your files. So when we get to the activity thing, I had one version, I had a folder of each different row on the sports table. There was a run component and a yoga component and a whatever component, and they were all different components all living in this activities folder. And they were just like variations. That's one way to go. In reality, when you get into a little more intensive applications that have data layers that are doing managing data in a more robust way, there's a pattern called Ducks, D-U-C-K-S, and I don't know why it's called that, that puts the model file, which sort of defines the data shape, and its persistence functions and its controller functions, like its routing, alongside its components all in one folder. And it's a really popular idiom. I find it like kind of wacky. I'll be honest, I've never really found anything I'm super happy with. I just sort of put so you get frustrated and explode. It's pretty frequent to have a folder just called like common or shared, where you'd put like your main UI elements like buttons and things like that. And then you might have a header folder that has like header logo component, header navbar component, header navbar item, individual component that pulls in a button component. Yeah, so you'll have lots and lots of these files as time goes on. There are lots of articles you can look up about people expounding what they feel are best practices. It probably depends on the size of your team, the context you're using it in. Fortunately, with sort of modern IE, so I'm usually like a Sublime text user. That's what I use for all, like I write Ruby daily. And it is just pretty bare bones. I'm finally getting on board with like a little bit more featureful. So I'm using VS Code here. And it's got some pretty nice refactoring tools where you just like highlight a function and export to a file. So I think anyone that's coming from like a more strongly typed language background, Java, is like, well, yeah, duh, that's how it's meant to be. But there are some nice refactoring tools with all this modern JavaScript that makes moving things from, you know, splitting a component out of a file into its own file pretty painless. Prettier is awesome. Prettier is awesome. It was the simplest database tool to set up and use for simple projects like this. The simplest database, I think, is like known to be SQLite. If you're just going to be running things locally. Yeah, so there's what we want for this project is a web endpoint, basically, and that's what we're going to come to in 2 steps from now. 3 steps from now is we're going to actually like suck in data over HTTP. So anything that you can use to give yourself a JSON endpoint will be your simplest database. So if you've got MySQL and a PHP front end that can give you some JSON, then you're golden. Or like Rails and Postgres, or what I want to do. So like this little project, I created it for the course, but I'm actually going to keep it. I've got this like vision of using Go, the programming language, and embedding an SQLite database in it, just as a little exercise for all my free time. Yeah, or no database. I mean, you could use where we're going with this is you can just suck in data over whatever API access you can find out there, and then store it in local storage. So that's what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be storing it in the browser. So a million downsides to that, the biggest being you're the only one that would ever have access to it. But yeah, basically anything that you can make a web server, have a web server endpoint, and then tie into whatever database you're most comfortable with. I've never used Firestore or Firebase, but a lot of people do it. I think it's a fantastic option for like standing up really quick apps. You can use something then, so Netlify, where I've posted the demo site, is basically a static site host. So they compile all the stuff that npm start does for me here. They do that, they host it, but they don't have databases or anything like that. So a lot of people will use Firebase or these like database as a server, key value store as a server things to have super lightweight web apps. Netlify, yeah, Heroku will execute code on each request. You can run a Rails site, or I think lots of sites. Yeah, Netlify is static sites where all the interaction is done client side. Neat. Okay, onward. Next up, we are going to work on adding a bit of state. So the fake problem is that, go back to our Chrome here, this data is going to get really long the more active we get. So it'd be nice to have a summary view, but it's also nice to be able to bounce back to this detailed view whenever we want it. In order to do that, we need a little bit of state. We need something that can change based on user interaction. There's a few places, well, no, at this point, there's not really a few places we could do that. The intuitive place, we need to choose where to put our state. So we could put it in each individual component. So we could put the state, 3 different copies of it, managed independently. And so that means you could toggle this guy to see the step summary or step details. And that would not affect these two because state doesn't go up It only stays where it is and goes down. Instead, what I want to do is one button that don't want to have to toggle each guy individually. So we're going to put our state in the app level, and then that can cascade down the three. Let's do it. So I'm going to start in app, and I'm going to put our state right up top. So as we said before, the state needs to come really early on. It should be the first thing. It helps with the readability, and React also enforces, there's some rules that are not relevant now, but you have to put your stuff up high. So just put it first, and then it'll be easy. So we import it, this use state function from React. And then we use it. So the state we want to have is we're going to have a Boolean. True or false guy. And I'm going to call it show summary. And we know with this use state hook, let's call it hook, we need the set version of it. So this is very similar to our counter we did before. So before, just as an example, we had set count, and it was numbers that went up and down. Now, we're just going to have this summary guy. So showing summary true or showing summary false. And I am going to render out the result of that in our debug line here. So we're just adding show summary to that bit of debugging code. So we need a little toggle function as well. We're going to call it function toggle summary. This is that mind-blowing JavaScript function in a function stuff. And it's going to set the show summary state item to the opposite of what it was. Invert it. And we need a button. So I'm going to put a little more JSX in here. Class name, navbar, button. On click is going to toggle the summary. Cut and paste a little bit of class names in just a second. So here, before I do that, so we've got a navbar component. It's got a button with an on-click handler that toggles the summary. So it's going to call this guy, which is going to invert whatever show summary is at. So we haven't modified our actual components, our child components yet. They're going to show the same thing no matter what. We're going to deal with that next. So I'm just going to paste in these like classes, all that styling. So let's take a look in Chrome, see how we're looking. Oh, I'm going to restart my NPM server. Pardon me. Let's start our server again. Toggle here. Doesn't do nothing. That's okay. So back to actually wire it up. So we need to pass whether we're showing the summary or not to these components. They need to know what to show. So I'm just going to pass it down like this. They each get the same thing. So we're taking here, this is like a really core React pattern. We're taking some of our state from a parent component, and we're passing it down as a prop to a child component. So in its move from prop, it's going to become rule. So if we go into vitals summary here, we're now going to have a new summary, a new prop available to us here. And I'm just going to copy and paste this pretty early on. So, or where are we going to put it? So we've got this show summary Boolean property now that comes from apps state. So if there's no measurements, show the no measurements box. If it's the show summary, however, then we're going to show a recent average instead. So the markup isn't super important, but the idea being, if that show summary prop is true, return early with a different set of markup. Otherwise, do this list thing. So I just need to import my recent average function from that lib folder. More libs. And I forgot that we want a units. Let's see how that works. Sorry, try to skip a step here. All right, let's see how we look. There we go. Toggle, 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 toggle. Do it all day. So this is again. Before I do, our dev tools here. So on my, you can see it's got some hooks now in here, and it's got the state of false. Unfortunately, it doesn't give it a name, so these get really confusing. You can see those change. And if you look at vital summary, each instance, they now have this show summary prop being passed to them. And we can even modify one of them, I think. Hijack it. Computer hackers. Hack your own website. So the data flow, back to the actual code, just to reiterate it one more time. Decide we need some Boolean. We need a Boolean flag in our state. We're going to call ours show summary. That name is just up to us. It gives us the reader and the setter function. Jumping down, we add a button with a click handler. And the click handler calls the setter with the opposite of what it was. It flips it. That's what that exclamation does. Regardless of whether we've clicked that or not, on every single render, we're passing the current value of show summary, this guy here on line 7, every single render that gets passed to each of the vital summary boxes as a prop. In vital summary, we now have a new prop. And if it's true, we bail out early with a short version. Otherwise, we continue on with our unordered list. Pretty neat. I'm just going to drop in a little bit of nice styles here and commit this up. And another check in on, make sure everyone's doing okay. Anything confusing at the moment? Look at those better. Now we got some nice borders around that. I'm just going to push that up. Any more questions, Ashley? Are we good for now?
I think we're good. We've had a bit of chat, but no questions yet.
All right. Waiting for time. How late do we go? Okay. Sure we have a decent time for TypeScript here. Okay, so next we're going to do a little bit more in components. So the next chunk we're doing, so you can see it, is this guy here. And this will give us a chance to do a little bit more in the world of components. Might go a small bit quicker, but not too much here. So we can close down vital summary. We're done with it for now. We still, just so we know the state of things, we haven't done our AJAX requests or anything yet. We're still just sucking in data that exists in constants in this like lib placeholder data. So all that stuff is coming. We're not quite there yet. But so we do want to bring in activities from this placeholder data. And just so we can see what that looks like. So here's an activity. It's got an ID and a timestamp, a name, a type, and a little bit of metrics attached to each one. So runs have distance and duration and average speed and heart rate. Other things just have heart rate and duration. So they need a little bit of a different presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an activities component, which is going to be a list. And it's going to have, so just catching my notes here. And it's going to have a couple different child components depending on what type of activity it is. So we're going to do this piece by piece. So the first, I'm just going to make an empty activities.js component, just so I have something to import. So export default function activities, and it's going to take props, and it's going to return temp activities for now. Got one. Just want to be able to import that into app and not have errors. So I'm going to import that guy. I want to add our activity list to our console debugging here, just so we can see that everything's loading. Oh, we want to show summary in there as well. Again, this is just for our sanity checks. It's not important to anything. Debugging tool. And so after our vitals boxes, we're going to put in a little bit of markup here. So we're going to put in an HR. When was the last time you used an HR tag? It's a really nice looking one. And this activities, and as we're passing in our activities array as its prop. So now if we check out Chrome, that is not our live one. Oh, start your NPM server after committing Alex. I'm gonna do. There we go. So all our guys up here are happy. Temp activities for now. In our dev tools, we see this activities component ready for magic. And it's getting its array passed in there. All my sporty doings. Okay. So let's create, let's fill out our activities thing a little bit more here. So it's kind of going to be a lot of cut and paste on this because you don't need to see all this typing of tables. So we want a data table. So I'll just walk you through how this is going to look. So here is the end result. So there's a div, an H3, a table, a T head. And we need to put our activities in here. And I'm going to call these rendered activities. So our props are going to give us an array, but they're not formatted yet. They're just like a JavaScript object with ID and type and all that. So rendered activities, we want to be a list of React components. So we're going to go props.activities.map. And just going to do a temporary one here. Here we go, tr. Let's see if this works. This is off script. Let's see how we go. So we're just listing through all the activities that are passed in, making a little table row. And so now rendered activities is a list of JSX elements. I'm going to put that in the T body. Auto format, lovely. Check it out. So there we go. So our core idea is working here. Those are a bunch of IDs, activity IDs. Back to the editor. So that's our rendered activities. It's just a really boring TR. So let's make an actual component building. In source folder, I'm making a generic activity. So we're going to do one for runs, and we're going to do one for generic for everything else. And should I type that? I can type that. No, we're not going to type this. Cut and paste. Here's our generic activity. So from the beginning, these are just formatters. So we saw that timestamp before was a millisecond timestamp. We want something a little nicer. The API gives us seconds. It's just a number. We want them as like hours and minutes and seconds broken out. So that's what these guys are for. But here's the actual React component. The component is called generic activity. It gets props. This is object destructuring. So I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is the way that you'd find this written in kind of the more real world. It is the same as going const name equals props.activity.name is what's going on down there. So I can put it back that way, just but this destructuring syntax is one you're going to see a lot. So if you're looking at a study guide, and this is new to you, search up object destructuring. It's all basically ways to get props off of an object. So now we have all these individual props, and we're making a nice, simple table row. Hopefully not too controversial, and at this point should be looking a little bit familiar. Kind of like HTML. This is the JSX, the pseudo HTML. And in the curly braces, we're injecting a little bit of JavaScript. So let's import that guy. So I'm back in the activities parent. This is our table. So to use a component, we need to import it. And so when we're listing through our activities early on here, instead of a boring old TR, let's give it a generic activity and pass in, as part of this array iteration, we get an activity, an individual one, and we'll pass it in as the prop to our generic activity. Did it work? It did. Runs and yogas and waits all up to the same, as expected, because they all use the same component. Checking out our inspector over here. Activities now has a bunch of children. And if you look over on the right, he has slightly different, or each component has slightly different activity going in components again. The last thing we wanted to do was create an extra activity, just so you can see how we would switch on something like that. So this is going to be the run. I'm going to do a little more cut and paste here. So runs are different. They have durations. They have different run types. So I'm going to call it a run activity. All these component names are just arbitrary. They're just ones that made sense to me. As we sort of mentioned earlier, this could be in activities folder /run.js. It's up to you, whatever makes sense to you. The naming is all in your control. I'm going to do a big cut and paste on this one, so brace your eyes. Bam. So here's run activity. So up at the beginning, we're importing all the little helpers to turn the raw API data into something a bit nicer. Just taking numbers and turning them into strings. So here is where we're actually making our run activity component. Starts here. I'm going to leave the destructuring this time, but destructuring. But so the idea is we have our props, our activity prop, and it's got all these different members, these properties on it. And the reason I do this is just a shorthand. It's all just a matter of taste. So instead of working on run type down here, I could go props.activity.run type. It just gets tedious. Instead of duration, I could go props.activity.duration. So this destructuring is just a pretty common idiom up top, is to take the variables that you're most interested in, the properties you're most interested in, make them a little more ergonomic. But these are functionally identical. So we destructure, just for ease of manipulation. We format the duration here. We're going to give ourselves a little badge based on the run type. So it's a JavaScript switch statement. The workout tracker tracks like a track run or a long distance run or no thing. And then same as with generic activity. And hopefully, again, this is starting to look pretty familiar. We're returning JSX, which could be other components. In this case, it's just a bunch of text inside table text, and exporting it to make it visible to the world. And so our component is a bunch of business logic, just regular JavaScript, and then a return block. So save this sucker, wire it up in here, run activity. So how do we make this work? How do we make it know? So in our little map here, we can have a conditional. So if activity type equals run, and return the run activity. And we know it needs an activity prop, or else it wouldn't even know what to render. Otherwise, return the generic activity. If we take a look at that, the run got that sweaty workout emoji and has distance and pace. So it's getting a little bit differently. If we look down here in the inspector, we'll see we've got a mix of different child component types. So this is a super common pattern that you'll see in your React life. React blends itself in data play really nicely together for data-driven sites. So you'll often be switching on data and presenting data over and over and over. Another thing I'll point out here, the different options for type are. When we get to TypeScript, that won't be a problem anymore. That'll all be well defined for us, and that'll be wonderful. So for now, we live in fear and hope we typed it right. Hope we didn't type running and messed up our entire application. I'll just live dangerously for another few minutes. This is another commit point. So I'm gonna, and then we're gonna go on loading data from. So we're feeling okay for now?
No comments in the chat or questions in the chat at the moment, but let's see. I had one again. There's no way, I guess, to use that generic activity that you have to extend it in some way, like an object-oriented kind of sense. To you get the idea?
Yeah. No. React doesn't really have that.
You're muted again.
Great question. And React doesn't really have that concept of extending things in an object-oriented way. It's not like an object with children. Instead, you would compose. So you would take pieces that are reused and suck them into a new parent component. So React, we could say, prefers composition instead of inheritance. Rightly or wrongly, that's a pretty strong design decision in the language. Cool. So on we go. I'm going to remember to start the server in advance now. Our next step is going to be to load data from the server. So this is going to get us into a new hook. So we've been using the state hook, use state. And so the hooks are designed to tell React something is going to change that's not a prop. So that React really wants to know what change. And if we want to change anything, we have to use these hooks. So we're going to do something now. We're going to hit the World Wide Web. We're going to hit an endpoint, and things are going to become really unpredictable for React. And it doesn't like that. HTTP requests can fail. They can be slow. They will return different data every time. So we need to mark really carefully to React that when you run this function, here is a crazy zone. This zone has side effects. Side effects is like the technical term or the term of art that React uses for things that aren't pure. So you can either have a pure function that is the same every single time and can be, you can skip rendering if the data hasn't changed, if the props haven't changed, or we can have some side effects. So you can't make anything much, or you can't make much useful without side effects. So we have to be able to have them, but we just have to mark them really carefully. So that's what this next area is going to touch on. And again, this is so we're talking about thinking in React. It becomes really interesting to think of your application in terms of which parts are pure and which parts have side effects. So React forces us to think about that. But if you're writing in any other context, it's really interesting to say, is this function a query? Does it have side effects? Is it modifying other things? And do you want to isolate those side effects, or do you want to mark them really carefully so you're really aware of them to make your execution much more predictable? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make a loading state. So what's going to happen is our app is going to load, and it's going to go have no data in it yet. It's going to display a pending state, and then it's going to go do an AJAX request and then render the data. That's the mission. So we're going to start by making a loading screen, because those are fun. App loading.js. This is going to be some cut and paste. So for anyone like coming from the world of jQuery and all that, I just get excited about having the loading screen in one tiny little isolated file. This isn't like some crazy part of your explicit state place, I should say. So here is a React component, yet another React component. We're making lots of them today. So here we've got some constant messages. These could maybe be translated into multiple languages. They're outside of the component because a component can access stuff that's not changing outside of it. So there's no reason for these to be in the component. They could be just as easily. They could be there. I like to keep them out to show that they're really constant. Then we have our app loading component. It has a prop called loading status. That's a string. And it's going to grab an appropriate string from our list here and return a tiny bit of markup displaying the message. So probably fairly familiar at this point. Then we want to show the loading status. And so this is something that changes over the course of the execution of our application. So this is a candidate for state, or it kind of has to be state. So the loading, we're going to make some more use state here. And this one is going to be a string. And it's going to be either ready or fetching or restoring or in the fetching state. And so there is our bit of state that we're going to modify as we progress along. And I'm just going to output that here. And we don't want to show our app at all while we don't have data. So I can add a little conditional here. If loading status is not ready, then we want to return app loading component. Oh, look at my IDE, just imported that for me up in line 5. I love you. Thanks. And we're doing the same as we did before. We're taking a piece of state and we're turning it into a prop to app loading. And so this loading status is now being passed down here. I think this is the equivalent to passing in fetching right now. So let's take a look how that, right, so we're bailing there and we're not rendering the app. So if the loading status ever becomes ready, it'll continue on through here. So here is our amazing temporary state. I just wanted to put in, no, we don't need anything more than that actually. Okay. So the next bit is going to be to actually load the data. How do we get out of this status? So to do this, we're going to use, I'm back to my console down here. I'm going to add a little library called Axios, which is an XHR. It's an AJAX library. It just makes it nicer to use AJAX. You could use anything. You could use raw XML HTTP request if you want it here. This is just a convenient one with a really simple surface area. Restart my server. So now we're going to start loading that data from public. Just to show you how that works, here's my local host. And I'm just going to go to that endpoint and we'll see how that works. It's just giving me that raw data. So even Even though we're pretending this is on a separate server at this point. No, you can check out the console as well. So dev tools or loading. So we need some URLs to hit. I'm going to hard code them right here. We've got 2 different endpoints to hit. Normally you'd pass these in from a prop higher up so you could do testing on them. It's really common to do these as data attributes on that div ID root that we had before. That'd be a really common place to do it. Or this would be one of the few places you'd have a window global sort of area. Mostly because when you're testing these applications, you want to be able to control the endpoints that you hit. So our loading status is fetching. We've got some endpoints. Let's do some actual fetching down here. Oh, so because activities are going to, and vitals are now going to change over the course of our application. So before we had them as these constants, but now they're not. Now they are state as well. Activities. And they are arrays. So these are arrays, but they're arrays stuffed full of our lovely data already. But we want to show that we can get fresh data from the real world. So I'm going to kill this. These are gone now. So we're on our own. We've got these empty arrays, and our AJAX requests are going to fill up those arrays. They're going to replace those arrays. So I'm just going to, as we go down, yeah, code is not happy with me now. All these old constants are going to become our states. I think we're okay. So just going to pause here just for a minute because that was a lot of changes. So instead of our constants up here, we're leaving them behind, and we now have empty arrays for vitals and activities, and we have this fetching status. So everything's temporary, everything's undone. And so if we load our app, fetching any unfetched whatevers, and if we look down in our hooks, we got all this empty temporary state. So let's fix it. Let's fill up those activities with actual JSON from the server. So like I said, when this is going to be our side effects. This is going to be our code that can't be run over and over and over. We've seen React likes to render multiple times, and we can't predict how many times it's going to run, and that's fine. But we need to be able to mark things that shouldn't be run a crazy number of times in their own way. And we do that by declaring it as a side effect. So here's a new piece of React for us. It's called use effect. All these hooks start with use. This one is the effect hook, or the side effect hook. It also needs to go fairly high up before there's any rendering, any loading status before this. So it takes a callback function, and it also takes a list of things, of inputs that cause it to re-render. So I'll come back to this little chunk for now. Suffice to say, just for now, this is an array, an empty array on purpose, and it means run it once. Yeah, we'll come back to that. So basically, this use effect is like a safety guard. It's saying, hey, React, pay attention, only run everything in this use effect function one time. So now we can write very regular AJAX code here. So Axios uses promises. And if you're not familiar with promises, they're a thing that in many languages, but in JavaScript uses promises. And so you can call a function, and you can not get its result right away. Instead, you get a promise to return its result at some point. And you can say, if it were, and then you can keep writing your code. And then this resolved successfully, or was it an error? It's a part of asynchronous code writing. It's quite common in JavaScript blend. So Axios get activities endpoint. So this is calling activities.json. So there's a promise. And then we call then on it. And this will just be executed whenever it gets a response. And I'll do it. Oh, I forgot to import Axios. I'll come back to that. Console debug got activity promise response. I'll just console log it out there. And then set activities to the response data. So what the heck is going on? Request, the get function returns a promise. I'm calling promises then method, which is like when you're successful method. It's giving me a response object. This is some Axios object. And I learned from the docs that I want the data property of that. And now I am setting some state. I'm setting the activity state. I forgot to import Axios. I'm going to do that now, and then let's try just this. So it looks the same. If I go to the console, I'll see that this worked though, and I got a data array of 51 items. Let's reload. Oh, and I see that I did, it's kind of hard to see down there. Come on, brother. I can see I did an AJAX request. Can I make you bigger? So my requests are working. And one of my state objects on app has a ton of stuff in it now. So let's do our other endpoint, because we've got two different APIs we're hitting here. So just when I was writing this, I was like, let's be fancy. Vitals promise. It's going to be identical. Axios get vitals endpoint. Vitals promise. Then same response. This is going to have the vitals JSON data. Got vitals promise response, and set the vitals bit of state to the response data from that endpoint. And one last little trick. We want to wait for both promises to end. And so JavaScript has like this meta promise called promise.all, which is really quite nifty, where you pass it a list of promises. Vitals promise. We call that like the meta promise. So the reason for all these promises is they let us work with APIs that respond at vastly different speeds. So we know when we get to here, set activities has been called, set vitals has been called. So we can set our loading status. We're ready. And that set loading status is our final bit of state. Comes ready. Save. So it's really fast because it's local. Fetching. And working. So now, if you look at the summary data, we got way more stuff because that endpoint was way more exciting. And the activities list is way longer. So that is the beginning of getting data from an external source. So the key points to that, so we just need to. But the most important concept here is that we took all this dangerous code, and dangerous means that you can't run it over and over and over. No effect, like making post updates might be HTTP deletes. We don't know what's going on in there. So we guard it in this use effect thing and say for it to run once. So I'm just going to commit this. XHR and push. I'm going to have to take like a 1-minute intermission here, and then I'll be back for some questions, and then we can look at either TypeScript or persistence, depending on how much time we want to spend. So I'll be right back.
So now I get to tell jokes for 20 minutes? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, take a break if you need a break. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them. And we'll continue probably with a bit of TypeScript when Alex comes back.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, okay. So do we have questions on that? That was kind of a big chunk. Oh, can it cost money? Oh, yeah, that would be a pretty, yeah. So the purpose of use effect is more like sort of like in a computer sciencey functional way, more than a business practice way. But it absolutely could. So it's more that if this JavaScript code ran over and over and over, we don't know what's going to happen. Like it's going to modify the React app in unpredictable ways. We're going out into the wide world. The JSON responses could be different every time. They likely will be different over time. And so we're telling React that this is a chunk of code that we can't guarantee the results. And so don't just keep running it. Only run it at very set times. But you could absolutely use that to make sure that you're not posting delete calls to a server and costing yourself like, terrible things if you're posting like delete latest. If this Ajax function was like a delete latest entry, and every time React rendered, which could be like 20 times for one page view, you're deleting 20 things instead of one, you're going to be sad in lots of ways. Yeah, exactly. If you delete all the items in your database, you will be having a bad time. Just for completion's sake, this little chunk down here, it says this little things change, and it will cause useEffect to run again. So useEffect doesn't have to be only once. So it could get, I don't really have a good example for it. So you'd pass in some variables here, like that, for example. And if either of those ever changed, this useEffect would run again. And every time one of those changed, the useEffect would run again. So you could have like a state counter, and every time someone clicks a button, and count was listed in this list of indices, then this effect would run again. So thinking about like useEffect is like kind of a mind-bending thing. It's probably not best for an intro to React. It's really interesting to read up on, but that's basically the mechanism. So anything that could result in a different function return goes in useEffect because it's a side effect. It's not pure. React loves things to be pure and loves to know when they're not going to be. So I guess we're at the 2-hour mark now. We could go into persistence, but I think maybe just dip into types and then call it a day. I'll post after the class. There was one last step we were going to do, saving to local storage. It's just an iteration on this, so it's not, you're not missing much right now. We will get to that. So TypeScript. What do I have to say about TypeScript? So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, or it's like an extension to JavaScript. I'm going to put this in the chat. There's a TypeScript Playground where we can just sort of experiment a little bit with it. So TypeScript is a way to add type declarations to JavaScript. And you can add them incrementally. So it's to be able to say that something is a string. So in this example here, they've got an example variable and they've called it a string with this little annotation afterwards. And now, well, let's try to make it a number. That's 2 reasons it can't work. So now type number can't be assigned to type string. So this is deceptively powerful, or maybe it's obvious to you now why that's so powerful. I spend so much time in my JavaScript code guarding against things like if null, if it's been defined, this whole parse int thing that I'll do like defensively, like I think it's an int, but not totally sure. So let's turn it to a string and then parse int, and then we'll really know. That's a whole class of code. I build like a little object with like some important data in. So I've got like my activity object being passed around our app, and I can't remember the fields on it, and I don't know if they're always going to be set. There's this whole amount of uncertainty that comes with writing in a dynamic language like JavaScript. There's a lot of flexibility, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And there reaches the point in every application where you're, that's having some rules enforced for you by your tools can be really helpful. At least that's what I've found. And so TypeScript lets us say what things must be, and what they may be, what their options are. It says this is nullable, or this can never be null, and always must be there. This can be a string or an int, or it can only be an integer. This is an object of this kind. And so this adds some overhead in one way. You have to write more types, and you can't just kind of do whatever you want, whatever's convenient. So you'll spend a little bit of time fighting it. but the upsides are this data safety. No more toString parse int, hope for the best. They just know it's an integer, or it's not. So like I said, I've found it hugely thing in pretty much anything, but to the point that I don't like writing JavaScript without it now. It may be different for you. But so here is, maybe we'll do 10 minutes of just adding some types to our application. And we will go around. So yeah, with the TypeScript Playground here. So I won't get too much into the syntax, but the ones that are useful to know. This guy we see, if you want to do an array of strings, string list, you would write it like that. And there's an alternate array of string. I wish there wasn't two, but there's two. So that's like that. And then string list, right, push high. So that'll be happy. But I bet this won't. All squiggly. All that safety we've got. And then the last one that we're going to look at a bunch is interfaces. And so an interface is like a reusable definition that can be applied to objects or classes. So they've created an interface called something. The naming is up to you, obviously. They're saying it has two properties on it, only two. A player is a string, and the score, because of this question mark, is an optional score, and it must be a number if it's defined. So score 5 as a string, no, that's not possible. So no more parse int. The player, my guy friends, does not exist on the type, the interface type, something. Pretty nifty. So in the little toy app, we're going back to our app and we're just going to add a bit of types. I've done a little bit of TypeScript configuration to it, so you can see that in the first commit in the repo. With Create React App, there's a version of it that you can just do your init like your initialize, your first run, to say, give me TypeScript from the beginning, and it does a fantastic job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two interfaces for the vital signs, the vital statistics object type, and the activity object type, because those are the data structures we're passing around the most. With TypeScript, you can go incrementally. You can just do one file, one function. You don't have to do your whole application, which is kind of nice. It does tend to spread, so it's hard to stop at one. Partly because you start to enjoy it, or I enjoy it. Yeah, the more TypeScript you have, the more your sort of application wants it. But you can start fairly small if you want. So the file extension for TypeScript, they do matter. So .ts is for TypeScript that's not got JSX in it. It's not got React in it. And then TSX is if you've got JSX in it. So we're going to have two interfaces. Vitals. And they have a timestamp, which is a number. Active energy. Copy and paste this. No point in watching the type. So a whole bunch of numbers on the vitals. We need to export that to make it publicly visible. And then one more for activity. I've prefixed it with a capital I just to show it's an interface. This isn't really the best TypeScript in the world. You normally define this elsewhere, but definitely will get our job done. So name and type are strings, the rest are numbers. Run type is this interesting one, and this is like an enum. So it's a defined, hoping that I got my typing right. Now, run type can only be this. It can never be something else. One other thing you're going to get is a ton of, if you're using like a VS Code or a modern IDE, you're going to get a ton of auto. So let's start small. And I'm going to take this generic activity and turn it into a TypeScript file to show how simple it is. So you rename it from JS to TSX because it's got JSX in it. And already we've got an error because React is typed. String is not assignable to a number. And so it turns out that React was forgiving our sloppy code before, but it actually really wants this to be an actual number. So that's great. That's bug one. Let's bring in our types. Import, what do we need here? We need activities. Activity from types. And so here's our new bit of syntax. So we're starting to see like a whole bunch of autocomplete. And you see it says any over all these because it doesn't know what they are. So this is a TypeScript file now, even though it doesn't actually have any TypeScript in it. It's able to detect some things are strings. That's cool. But these are all any's. So I'm going to do, I'm going to make a tiny little interface here. I'm going to call it props. And I'm going to say the props for generic activity has a key called activity, and its type is of the activity interface type. I just called this props because I wanted to. I could call it my cool internal props because nobody else is going to see these. They're all just within this file unless I chose to export them. And I'm going to say that this props argument is of that type. So now that like one tiny little thing has opened up a whole world for us. So now bouncing over all of these are strings. And it's smart, like I'm destructuring them there. I'm taking them off that object. And so if I want to go duration times name, it's not going to have it. Not allowed. That duration times timestamp, no problem. That is allowed. And if I'm just messing around, props dot, oh cool, I've got autocomplete. Activity dot. Sweet. Workout, long run, default, or it could even be no. Super handy. So this is the beginning of like the benefits you get from TypeScript. And so you can imagine, passing one of my biggest classes of bugs and frustrations in defensive coding is dates and never knowing when I've converted them out of timestamps. And so to be able to say, here, we'll do one of them right here. This format seconds as time, because it can work with our helpers as well. This is what format seconds as time looks like. It's not that exciting. I'm going to turn this into a TypeScript component. And I'm going to say that seconds has to be a number. And then I'm going to return a bit of JSX. I'm just going to put in a span. So now format seconds as time must always a number, and it's going to turn, as you see there, a JSX element suitable to be used in a JSX component. So if I go back here, it knows that now. It knows that seconds must be a number. So if I put in some crazy date, it's not going to work. And so catching these errors now is when we want to catch them. So it won't let you compile. It won't let your app run in your development environment if these aren't dealt with. And there's escape hatches. There's all sorts of ways you can make it a little more ergonomic for yourself. But even just that sort of catch is like, is duration, is it a date yet? Or timestamp, I should say. Anyway, is it a date yet? Has it been converted to a time? Like, where are we at? And checking it, checking the object prototype. Not having to do that takes out so much defensive code, so much inspective code, so much fearful code. And you just know, sweet, it's a number. It's always a number. I don't have to check if it's a number here. I don't have to check is nan. I know it is because if it's gotten to this point, it's okay. So there's a little bit of TypeScript. I'll just do a tiny bit more so we can see how this goes. We'll go up a level to our activities list. And turn you into TSX. If you end up trying this yourself, you'll need to stop and restart your NPM server when you rename a file like this, or else it won't know what you've got. So the same error down below, call span, it's not allowed to be a literal string. It's actually meant to be a JavaScript number. So that little bug caught. I'm going to bring in our I activity again from types. And I'm going to make the props interface for just this component. So again, these aren't for any other components. Each component will probably have its own. You can call it whatever you want. We know that the props are an array of I activity. So we could call it like that. And we now use it. So what a sort of autocomplete have we got? We now know that activity, when we map it here, when we loop through, we have all our autocomplete on it. We know what it is. We know that the timestamp is an integer at this point. We have all that sort of magic. What was the component we did? We did generic activity. We also know, so generic activity, you can see it's sort of got that my cool internal props reference to it as well. So if I pass this here, or this one, it knows that that doesn't belong on that component. We haven't done run activity yet, so run activity is just fine. And then we can pass it all sorts of crazy stuff. But now our type-scripted component isn't having that. So again, it's saving us from ourselves. And as your applications grow, I mean, there's a lot of props to keep track of, and they change over time. So in terms of confident refactoring, knowing the TypeScript compiler is going to freak out at you if something doesn't match anymore is just this nice level of confidence in the world of JavaScript, which can be pretty wild westy. So we'll do a tiny bit in app.js and then we'll wrap it up. So renaming app to .tsx. Probably run this in the browser. Nothing in a browser should change whatsoever. Make sure we're still running okay. Lovely. So I'm going to import our two types again, or both types this time. I vitals and I activity from types. Okay. Oh, I didn't actually rehearse this with Axios. So let's see how we go. So these use states are pretty important to us. Like this show summary, if we don't know it's a perfect bool, it doesn't really matter. But the activities and the vitals, they're pretty important. So we want to make sure we type them properly. And the way to do that in use state, so there's your use state, you know, whatever, is to open angle brackets and put the type in there. So without and with a type, or string, or I activity, or an array of I activities. So that's the syntax. So let's put our types in. So that's Boolean. Probably not saving us from any bugs, but nice to have. And then we hover over this, show summary, Boolean. Autocomplete is pretty great. We'll call this a string. But even more useful would be, right, like that now again. So that would stop us from putting the wrong thing in there. Set loading status. And it tells us what we can have. Nope. And then these guys. So in activities gets I activity array. So I fully acknowledge what an insane piece of code this is. Hopefully we've built up to it. So there's without angle brackets, I activity, and an array of them. Same thing here. I can tell you your type. It's going to be I vital. It's going to be an array of you. And so now, as we go along, this just passes down. The entire document now has possible types. And it prevents us from doing anything we can't do. Super handy. So that's TypeScript. It's easy to add in little pieces, and it's been a pretty huge win for me. So I would encourage you to try it out if it is of interest to you. And that'll be good for now, I think. Any questions, comments, big thoughts? I like it. I like it too. Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we've had a lot of, I don't know if we have any other questions or comments right now, but we've had a lot of people message and say thanks and looking forward to the video as well. So.
Just the three of us
no, there's 12 of us here right now. A few people jumped out early, but yeah.
So don't know how to use them. Right on. Okay, well, I will be posting a little bit more complete notes to that repo in the next hour or so. If you want any of that, I'll post my email there if you want to get in touch.
This has been great. Thank you very much, Alex.
Nice.
Some thank yous coming in on the chat as well. We very much appreciate it. I think this was great. Good pace and lots of great information. So well done.
Fair enough. Thanks. That was really fun.